Hi, folks. I'm William Beasley, a professor in WVU's Instructional Design and Technology program. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about applying the idea of netiquette to video conferencing. Why? Well, in recent years, we've evolved a pretty standard sense of netiquette in what are called asynchronous situations, things like email and threaded discussions online. We know not to write in all capital letters. We know to avoid posting inflammatory comments. We know to be careful with the use of humors because interpreting humor can be hard in the absence of body language and voice tone. But the recent pandemic has caused a big surge in what are called synchronous communications, things like Zoom that we're using right now, or Collaborate Ultra in eCampus. And we're using those for emergency remote delivery of instruction. This has caught a lot of educators and students by surprise. The technology is new to many of these people, and in the absence of prior experience, neither's entirely sure how to behave courteously in this virtual public setting. So whether you use Zoom or Collaborate Ultra or Google Meets or some other tool, the basic ideas that I'd like to talk about here should apply. Let's start with the idea of visibility. It's generally a good thing in video conferencing, but the rules may differ a little bit depending on whether you're presenting a lecture or leading a discussion or acting as a relatively passive participant. I'll switch my settings around a little bit to talk about some of the possibilities. So I deliberately began a few minutes ago with myself fully visible and clearly labeled, which is a best case scenario. Notice that as you listen to me right now with no video image at all, this starts to feel a lot more like a telephone call than a video conference, and it's probably easier for you to lose interest. Some programs automatically show your display name at a video conference, and others don't. If at all possible, even if you can't provide a profile picture, you should at least supply a display name so people know that you're there. For some reason, Zoom won't actually record my display name when I'm not using a profile picture, though in real life it will show that combination in a video conference. So I can't show you that particular combination right now. If no image and no display name is the worst case scenario, which I would suggest that it is for either an instructor or a student participant. Having no image but a display name visible would be a one-step improvement. The next level improvement would be to include a profile picture, which is a still image. Give me just a second here to add my profile picture back in. There. Now you have some idea of who's talking to you. This is a recommended minimum where possible for both instructors and students. That is, a profile picture. I'm guessing that this is feeling less like a phone call and more like a video conference now. I ask all of my students to do at least this much to provide a profile picture. There is one other step that's often possible if participants have a good fast internet connection, which is to use live video instead of a still image profile picture. But not all live video is created equal. I've switched to live video here. You can tell that I'm present in the moment, but you notice I'm just a shadow. The problem here is the light is behind me rather than in front of me. I'm in front of a brightly lit window right now. So I'm going to get up and I'll move. And as soon as the light is more in front of me than behind me, you can begin to see my face, a distinct improvement in the loud video. Okay. So now we're better. But there's still some issues here. This is not a virtual background behind me. This is a real background. You can see the stairway and my front door. And there is a real possibility that somebody might come through the door or come down the stairway. So a lot of people will choose a virtual background to obviate that particular possibility. So we'll pick a virtual background here. But not all virtual backgrounds are created equal. This particular background means you can't see somebody coming down my stairway or through my front door, but it's kind of distracting. It's not a good idea to choose a virtual background that has a lot of motion or a lot of distracting images of one kind or another, especially if you're the instructor delivering a lecture or leading a discussion here, because people may pay more attention to the goats in the background than they do to you. Not a good thing. So my recommendation would be, if you're going to choose a virtual background, choose a virtual background that is somewhat less distracting. I'll try doing that. Since we're in an academic environment, this may work a little bit better. Not all programs let you choose a virtual background. Zoom is well known for allowing this. Collaborate Ultra does not. So with Collaborate Ultra, you need to choose a relatively plain physical background and try to make sure the door is closed so that no 3-year-olds come screaming through. Where you can use video, it's a good idea to use video because it increases the presence of the individual involved. If you're concerned about your appearance on video, one of the things that will often help is if you can raise the camera somewhat. It tends to be a bit more flattering, especially to those of us who have a few years on us. Camera angles that are very low, if you don't have a beard and you happen to have multiple chins, they will probably be visible, which most people don't find flattering. That's part of Netiquette, but if part of Netiquette is using video where possible, one of the issues involved is how do you deal with people's concerns about their physical appearance online. You can't always use video. If you have a poor internet connection, you may have to turn off video in order to preserve good audio quality. But at least in the case of the instructor, video helps students pay attention. If you're there in full moving video, it feels more like a lecture. In the case of students, if they're using video, it helps you to show that they are at least sitting in front of their computer right now instead of down in the basement putting in a load of laundry, which can be somewhat reassuring. So that's the first bit of Netiquette. Make yourself and your identity as clearly visible as possible to the others present. Join the video conference with at least a profile picture, preferably labeled with your name. Use live video if at all possible, unless you're asked to turn off the video by the instructor or the session leader. Now, let's move from eyes to ears. You may or may not have noticed that I'm wearing a set of earbuds with a microphone. There's the microphone. This was a deliberate choice on my part. Many people video conference using just the microphone on their laptop or tablet or phone, but those microphones pick up a lot of ambient sound. If you're in a quiet place, and you're confident that place is likely to remain silent, this is seldom a problem. However, especially in the current working from home situation, even backgrounds that begin in silence can change without warning. My neighbor mows his lawn loudly and regularly. My dog barks much more loudly and much less predictably, unless I see the mail carrier in the distance, in which case I know he's about to go ballistic. Using earbuds with a microphone, or even better, a headset with a boom microphone, something like this, which I also often use. These have less of a tendency to pick up ambient sounds than just using the microphone on your computer. But even more important, and this is the big deal about Netiquette, if you mute your microphone when you're not actually speaking, you remove the possibility that the sound of your kids yelling in the next room will be shared with the entire video conference. There's a famous recent case where in the first Supreme Court arguments that were done online via video conference, there was the sound of a toilet heard flushing in the background, although the individual who had neglected to mute their microphone has not been identified in this case. This is one of those cases where the situation differs a bit for instructors and others. If you're the instructor, it's best to use a headset mic and leave it unmuted if possible, since you're speaking most of the time. If you are a student or another participant, it's best to join with your microphone muted. If you need to speak, unmute your microphone and then mute it again when you're finished speaking. If all participants are careful to do this, it can make a huge difference in the video conference. Without it, chaos would sometimes be a kind descriptor. With it, I've seen one with close to 200 participants go smoothly. So from an audibility standpoint, the most important thing you can do is remember to mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and remember to unmute it when you want to speak. Folks will generally let you know if you forget to unmute and try to speak, but it can be mildly embarrassing and you might like to avoid that. For further audibility improvement, Try to be sure you're in an environment that will remain quiet and use a headset or earbud microphone. Both have the additional advantage of making it easier to hear what's going on in the video conference. So make yourself visible with minimal visual distractions. Make yourself audible without extraneous noise. Those are the two basics for video conferencing netiquette that apply almost everywhere. How about interactivity? That's an area where netiquette will be somewhat variable depending on your setting and how you as the instructor would like the online session to proceed. So let's go there now. Here are some questions you need to know the answers to before your video conference. Is this going to be a lecture or a discussion? If it's a lecture, will you take questions during the lecture, after the lecture? If it's a discussion, do you want to moderate it or allow for free-form interaction? Do you want students to be able to ask questions? If so, how do you want them to signal that they have a question? Raise their hand, literally, in the video window if they're using live video, or maybe using the icon available for responses on screen. Do you want them to type their question into the chat window? Do you want students to be able to use the whiteboard or the annotate tools or the screen sharing functions of your video conferencing program? If you do want them to use those, do you want them to ask for permission first? And if so, how should they ask for permission? Raise a hand, type the question in the chat window. Do you want students to be able to converse privately in the video conference chat window or only be able to use it publicly? Do you want students to be able to use the chat window at all? Collaborate Ultra allows the instructor to disable the chat window entirely. Especially with large undergraduate classes, allowing the chat window can be both distracting and sometimes disruptive, kind of like passing notes in a physical class. Obviously, there's a lot more variability in the interactivity area than in the identity area. Good netiquette dictates that everyone be clearly visible, labeled, and at least potentially audible. Good netiquette around the issue of interactivity also means that the instructor will clearly communicate sensible policies and procedures, and students will at least do their best to comply. So here are some suggested starting points for netiquette policies and settings around interactivity. We'll go into screen share mode so that we can actually use some visual aids here. Obviously, there's lots of room for individual variability in how you implement the ideas here. The important things are that you settle on a combination of netiquette policies and procedures that work for you in accomplishing what you would like in your class, and that you clearly communicate this information to your students. So, before the conference, your netiquette expectations have been clearly communicated with the students. Why? Mostly for efficiency. If everybody starts off with the right settings and the right equipment, time's not going to be wasted trying to explain what you want and how to accomplish it. Also, before the conference, you've run an audio and video test on your own equipment and setup because there's always glitches, and we sometimes forget to change settings when we need to for different situations. Model the behavior you expect for your students. Make sure your microphone's working. Make sure you have a profile picture, preferably with a display name. Make sure your video camera is working. The students can see your full face and the lights in front of you rather than behind you. And then as the conference begins, you enter the conference with your video on if you have sufficient bandwidth. You enter the conference with your microphone on so you can greet students as they come in. This also gives students a chance to be sure they can hear you and you can hear them in the moments before the class actually begins. Students enter the conference with their video on, if bandwidth allows, and their microphone muted. They come in with a muted microphone. Your microphone is on. Why? The combination makes it clear who's present without contributing to background noise as the growing number of students enters the virtual room. During the online video conference, questions, comments, or requests to speak on the part of students get typed into the chat window where you can see them. Private chat is disabled. All content typed in chat will be visible to everybody. This avoids people having side conversations that have nothing to do with your class. It's less disruptive that way. Also during the conference, Student screen sharing, that is the ability for students to share their screen, and the student's ability to use various tools are initially disabled. You can enable these if you need them for your class when you need them. They're powerful tools, and they can be very disruptive if students begin to use them without your knowledge or supervision. Actually, with most of my graduate classes, I turn these tools on from the beginning to get a more free-flowing exchange of information, but my experience has been undergrads sometimes abuse this capability. So, in summary, everybody should be as visible as possible while minimizing visual distractions as part of their visibility. Everybody needs to be clearly audible, but only when they're actually contributing and without extraneous noise, the lawnmower, the crying child, the barking dog. You should establish netiquette expectations for an online session before the session itself occurs. You should clearly communicate these expectations to your students before the session and be prepared to moderate these behaviors during the class. This involves things like reminding them to mute their microphone when they forget to do that, or requesting that they put up a profile picture if they haven't actually done so. One other point for you. Some of this stuff is probably new to you, which is fine. It was all new to all of us at some particular point. Your students are no different in that respect. So when it's still early days for your online video class, you should be prepared to tell them how to do the things you're asking them to do, like how to mute a microphone, or you should at least be prepared to point them toward relevant technical support assistance. So that's about it. Thank you for your time. Best of luck in your ongoing video conference class endeavors.